All right, so eviction. Nobody wants to deal with that. It can be really overwhelming. But before anyone panics out there, we're here to help you navigate this whole world of eviction hardship extensions.
Yeah.
And arm you with the knowledge you need to, potentially hit pause on that process. Think of this as a deep dive into buying yourself some valuable time.
What we're really talking about here is a safety net, not a way to avoid paying rent indefinitely.
Right.
These extensions are designed to give you breathing room when unexpected life events knock you off your feet.
Exactly. And it's not just about, knowing these extensions exist. It's about understanding how they work. We've got some articles here outlining the whole process from eligibility to additional resources if you're in a really tough spot.
Right.
By the end of this, you'll have a much clearer picture of how to approach this and what steps you can take.
Yeah, and that's the crucial point. Understanding your rights and options can make all the difference.
Yeah.
But remember, this isn't a one-size-fits-all situation. Mm-hmm. Eligibility really hinges on two things: your specific circumstances and where you live.
So location plays a huge role. I hadn't really considered that.
It does.
Wow.
Some areas have really strong tenant protection laws, which might make it easier to qualify for an extension.
Okay.
Others might have very limited options. That's why it's so important to research your local regulations right off the bat. You need to know the lay of the land, so to speak.
That makes sense. So let's say you're facing a hardship. What kind of situations would even qualify someone for an extension? Is it just about not having enough money for rent?
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. Think about it this way. Hardship extensions are designed for situations that severely impact your ability to pay rent, but are temporary in nature. It's about proving that you're going through a rough patch, not that you can never pay rent again.
So like a sudden job loss or a medical emergency that drains your savings.
Those are classic examples. The Hemlane article even mentions domestic violence situations and natural disasters, events that throw your life into chaos and make paying rent impossible, at least for the short term.
Okay, so it's not just about financial hardship, but also these unforeseen circumstances that disrupt your life. That makes sense. But like you said, it has to be temporary.
Right.
So what happens if the hardship is longer term? Is there any hope then?
It gets trickier, I'll admit. The expectation is that you'll eventually be able to pay rent again. That's why showing a plan for recovery is so important.
Right.
Landlords want to see that you're actively trying to get back on track, whether it's through applying for assistance, finding a new job, or exploring other income options.
So it's not just about pleading your case, but actually demonstrating a clear path forward.
Exactly.
It sounds like a repayment plan is going to be pretty crucial here.
Absolutely. It's like saying, look, I'm committed to making things right. Here's how I plan to catch up on the rent I owe. It shows your landlord you're serious about meeting your financial obligations.
Would a landlord ever flat out refuse to even consider an extension?
Sadly, it can happen, and this is where things can get complicated. But it's important to remember that even if your initial request is denied, it's not necessarily the end of the road. There might be options for appeal or negotiation.
So don't lose hope right away.
Right.
It sounds like the next step is understanding the actual process of requesting an extension. What does that look like?
Well, before you even put pen to paper, the most crucial first step is often overlooked. Review your lease agreement.
Really? Why is that so important?
You'd be surprised how many people skip this. Your lease might actually outline specific procedures for hardship extensions or policies for handling these situations.
Okay.
It's your first clue to understanding your landlord's potential approach.
Okay, so you're telling me I need to dust off that lease agreement. What should I be looking for specifically?
Look for any language related to hardship, force majeure, or unforeseen circumstances. These clauses could outline specific conditions, deadlines, or documentation requirements. It sets the stage for how your landlord might interpret your request.
So it's like getting inside their head a little bit.
Yeah.
And anticipating their concerns. That's smart.
Exactly. It helps you tailor your request and address their potential concerns from the get-go.
Okay, so let's say you've scoured your lease and you're ready to make the request. What's next?
Gather your evidence. Remember, you need to prove that you're facing a legitimate hardship. This means collecting documentation that supports your claim. Think termination letters, medical bills, police reports, anything that backs up your story.
Wait, so it's not enough to just explain your situation. You need actual proof.
It's all about building a strong case. The more documentation you have, the more seriously your landlord will take your request. Imagine it like presenting your case to a judge. You need the evidence to back up your claims.
So it's like putting together a hardship file. Okay, I'm starting to see how seriously I need to take this. What about actually submitting the request? Is a phone call enough? Or does it need to be more formal?
Definitely make it formal. We're talking about a written request, not a casual conversation. It needs to be documented and clear.
So, what exactly should this written request include?
Think of it as a clear, concise explanation of your situation. You're laying out the facts, explaining the hardship you're facing, and outlining how long you think you'll need this extension.
And of course, that crucial repayment plan we talked about.
Exactly. Include that repayment plan as well. Show your landlord you're proactive and serious about fulfilling your financial obligations. Detail how you plan to catch up on rent once the extension period is over.
Okay, so you've sent the request. Then what? Do you just wait for the landlord to get back to you?
Not exactly. This is where deadlines come into play. Most areas require you to give your landlord a certain amount of notice before your rent is due. We're talking anywhere from 10 to 30 days, so check your local laws on that. Don't leave it to the last minute.
So it's all about being proactive and not making assumptions.
Right. And once you've sent that request, make sure to follow up. If you haven't heard back within a week or so, send a polite follow-up email or letter just confirming they received your request.
So you're saying it's okay to be a little persistent.
Within reason, absolutely.
Yeah.
You want to make sure your request hasn't gotten lost in the shuffle. And if they do approve your request, get it in writing.
Wait, why is that so important? Isn't a verbal agreement good enough?
Trust me, it's not worth the risk. You need a written confirmation from your landlord that clearly outlines the terms of the extension and that agreed-upon repayment plan.
Got it.
This protects both of you down the line if any disputes arise.
So it's all about clarity and making sure everyone is on the same page, no room for misunderstanding.
Exactly. Open communication and solid documentation are your best friends in these situations. But what happens if, despite all your efforts, your landlord says no to the extension request?
That's what I'm really worried about. What happens then?
Well, that's where things can get a bit more complicated, but definitely not hopeless.
Okay.
There are still avenues to explore and resources that can help you navigate this tricky situation.
Well, let's dive into those options right after we take a quick pause. We'll be right back to explore what happens when a landlord isn't so willing to grant an extension.
So you've meticulously followed all the steps, submitted a heartfelt request with supporting documentation, and even proposed a solid repayment plan. But the landlord still says no. It's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
But before you panic, remember, it's not necessarily game over.
Okay. That's somewhat reassuring. What are my options at this point? Do I just have to accept the denial?
Not at all. The first thing you need to do is understand why your request was denied.
Okay.
Was there missing documentation? Did they feel the hardship wasn't temporary enough? Or maybe they just didn't buy your repayment plan. Figuring out their reasoning is your first step.
So it's like a detective game almost, figuring out where the weak points were in my request.
Right.
But what if I truly believe I met all the requirements and the denial just seems unfair?
Yeah.
Is there any recourse then?
Absolutely. If you believe the denial was unjustified, you might be able to appeal the decision.
Okay.
And that's where things can get a bit more complex. Understanding local laws and procedures becomes crucial.
Okay, this is where I start to feel lost. Where can someone even begin to navigate this appeals process? It sounds intimidating.
Don't worry, you don't have to go it alone. That's where legal aid comes in. There are organizations out there specifically designed to help tenants facing eviction. They can provide advice, guidance, and even represent you if necessary.
So it's like having a guide in a complex legal maze. I'm starting to understand why you keep emphasizing the importance of knowing your rights and resources.
Exactly. They can help you understand the appeals process, ensure your rights are being protected, and make sure you're not being taken advantage of. It's a lifeline when you're feeling overwhelmed.
The Hemline article we have actually mentions that some areas have penalties for landlords who unfairly deny hardship extensions. Is that right?
It is. In some jurisdictions, landlords can face fines or other consequences for rejecting a valid request.
Wow.
It's a way to protect tenants and ensure landlords aren't abusing their power. So even if your initial request is denied, knowing these laws exist can give you some leverage.
Okay, that makes me feel a bit better.
Oh.
So even if a landlord is being difficult, it's not a guaranteed eviction just because they said no. There are still ways to fight back.
Precisely. And before you even jump into an appeals process, it's always worth trying to negotiate with your landlord directly. Remember, communication is key.
Right, you've been saying that from the start. But how do you negotiate with someone who's already said no?
It's all about understanding their perspective. Maybe they had concerns about your documentation or your proposed repayment plan.
Right.
Explain your situation in detail, address their concerns, and try to find a compromise that works for both of you.
So maybe a revised repayment plan or even a temporary rent reduction could be on the table.
Exactly. Remember, eviction is costly and time-consuming for landlords, too.
Yeah,
They might be more willing to negotiate than you think.
that's a good point. It puts things in perspective.
Yeah.
So we've talked about what to do when a landlord says no, but let's shift gears a bit and talk about those additional resources you mentioned. You said there's help available even if the eviction process has already started. What did you mean by that?
This is where we bring in a dose of hope. Even if things have escalated, there are programs and organizations designed to help people facing housing crises.
Okay, this is what I need to hear right now. Tell me more about these resources.
Rental assistance programs are a great place to start. Both federal and state governments offer programs that can provide financial aid to help cover rent payments.
That sounds like a lifeline for someone struggling to make ends meet. How do these programs work? Are there any specific ones you can mention?
Well, there are quite a few, and they vary depending on your location and circumstances. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or ERA, is one example. It was created during the pandemic, but has been extended in many areas. It can provide funds to cover past due rent and even future rent payments for those who qualify.
So this could actually prevent an eviction from happening in the first place.
Exactly. And there are other programs, too, like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, often referred to as Section 8, which provides ongoing rental subsidies to low-income families. These programs usually have income limits and eligibility requirements, so it's important to do your research and see if you qualify.
This is so helpful. Are there other resources besides government programs?
Absolutely. Don't forget about nonprofits and charities. Organizations like the United Way, the Salvation Army, and even local churches often have programs to help with rent, utilities, and other essential needs.
Right. They can often provide more immediate assistance, which is crucial when you're in a crisis.
Exactly. And while you're exploring these resources, don't underestimate the power of simple communication with your landlord.
You're really hammering that point home, and I'm starting to see why.
It's that important. Reaching out to your landlord as soon as you realize you might have trouble paying rent can make a world of difference. Being upfront and honest shows responsibility and a willingness to work things out.
It's so much better than trying to hide the problem and hoping it goes away.
Exactly. Landlords are often more understanding and willing to work with you if you're open and proactive.
Yeah.
They're human, too, and they understand that life throws curveballs sometimes.
Okay, so we've talked about eligibility, requesting an extension, what to do if the request is denied, and a whole bunch of resources for help. But what happens if things really escalate and the case ends up in court? I'm trying to imagine the worst case scenario here.
It's a scenario we hope to avoid, but it's important to be prepared. If you've already been served with an eviction notice, appearing in court is absolutely crucial.
This is where things start to feel really serious. What exactly happens in court?
Well, it's a legal process, and it can vary depending on your location. But the key takeaway here is that even at this stage, there might be legal defenses you can present.
Wait, so it's not a guaranteed eviction just because you're in court?
Right. You might be able to argue that the eviction is retaliatory, meaning the landlord is trying to evict you for unfair reasons. Or maybe your landlord hasn't properly maintained the property, or you've paid rent that they claim you haven't. But of course, you'll need evidence to support these claims.
So those receipts, communication logs, photos of any issues with the property, those all become critical pieces of evidence.
Exactly. Documentation is your best friend in these situations. And during the court hearing, you can also request a stay or continuance, which basically buys you more time before being evicted.
So it's not an immediate eviction order. There's still some wiggle room.
There can be. A stay would give you more time to negotiate with your landlord, find a new place to live, or apply for those emergency rental assistance programs we discussed. It's not a permanent solution, but it can buy you valuable time.
Okay, that's good to know. But it all sounds incredibly overwhelming. Is there any way to navigate this without getting completely lost in the legal jargon?
You're absolutely right. It can be intimidating. That's why I can't stress enough how important legal aid is in these situations. Remember those organizations we talked about earlier? They can be your lifeline.
Right. They can help explain everything in plain English and make sure I understand my rights.
Exactly. They can provide guidance, advice, and even represent you in court, often for free or at a very low cost. They're a truly invaluable resource for anyone facing eviction.
One of the resources we have for this deep dive is information about the Martinez Law Center in California. Can you tell us a bit more about them?
Absolutely. They're a great example of a legal aid organization specifically focused on helping tenants, not landlords. That's a key detail for someone feeling overwhelmed and unsure where to turn.
So they're 100% on the side of the tenant. That's reassuring.
Exactly. They're dedicated to protecting tenants' rights and helping them navigate these complex legal processes. And this brings up an interesting point. We've covered a lot about this immediate crisis of facing eviction, but what about the long term? How can someone avoid finding themselves in this situation again?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's one thing to survive this eviction, but how do you prevent it from happening all over again?
That's where the focus shifts from crisis management to prevention. And a lot of it comes down to planning, communication, and, you guessed it, knowing your rights.
I'm sensing a theme here. Where would you suggest someone even begin to tackle this? It feels like a huge task.
Well, it starts with something we all grapple with: budgeting. Creating a realistic budget that prioritizes rent as your most important expense is crucial.
Okay, so it's about getting real with your finances and making sure rent is always covered. But what if unexpected expenses pop up? Life is full of surprises.
That's why tracking your income and expenses carefully is so important. Look for ways to reduce non-essential spending if you need to. Even small adjustments can make a big difference over time. And this brings us back to that all-important communication with your landlord. It's not just for hardship extensions, it's crucial in general.
So it's about building a good relationship with your landlord from the start.
Exactly. Aim for a respectful and professional relationship. If you anticipate any difficulties paying rent, even if it's just a temporary setback, let your landlord know as soon as possible.
So don't wait until you're already behind and facing an eviction notice. Open communication is key.
Precisely. Being proactive and transparent can help you avoid a lot of stress and potential legal trouble.
Okay, so we've got budgeting and communication down. What else is important for preventing future evictions? I'm taking notes here.
Make sure you understand your lease agreement thoroughly. Don't just skim it and sign.
I know. Lease agreements can be full of legal jargon, but you're saying it's worth taking the time to really understand what I'm agreeing to.
It is. Pay close attention to those clauses related to late payments, notice periods, and the grounds for eviction. If anything is unclear, don't be afraid to ask for clarification.
That's a good tip. I always feel intimidated asking questions about legal documents, but it's better to be safe than sorry, right?
Absolutely. And finally, and this should come as no surprise, know your rights as a tenant.
Right. You've been hammering that point home throughout this entire deep dive.
It's crucial. Familiarize yourself with the renter's rights and landlord-tenant laws in your state and local area. These laws cover things like security deposits, habitability standards, discrimination protections, and of course the eviction process itself.
So it's about taking control of my housing situation and being an informed and proactive tenant.
Exactly. It's about knowing your rights, communicating effectively, and taking steps to prevent problems before they escalate into a crisis.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive so far. We've covered so much ground, from the nitty-gritty of hardship extensions to all sorts of resources and even strategies for preventing future evictions.
It's a complex topic, and hopefully we've helped to demystify some of it and given our listeners some practical tools to navigate this challenging situation.
Absolutely. But before we wrap things up completely, we have a few final thoughts and a thought-provoking question for our listener to ponder. Stay tuned for that right after a quick pause.
Wow, we've really dug deep into this whole eviction hardship extension thing today.
Yeah.
From understanding what they are to actually navigating the request process to exploring all those resources. We even touched on ways to prevent future evictions. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And I think, even after all this information, what's really important to remember is that you're not alone in this.
Right.
Facing a potential eviction is stressful, but there are systems in place and resources to help you through it. Don't give up hope. I think that's a really important takeaway. It's easy to feel so isolated when you're facing this, but knowing there's help out there, that can make a huge difference. And we've talked about the importance of gathering all that documentation, communicating clearly with your landlord, and knowing when to reach out for legal aid. Those are all such crucial steps.
Yeah, and thinking beyond the immediate crisis. Those long-term solutions we discussed are really key to breaking the cycle of housing instability. Budgeting, building a good relationship with your landlord, and just understanding your lease agreement can go a long way in preventing future evictions.
Right. It's about taking control of your housing situation, being informed and proactive. But it makes me wonder, given how complex these laws are and how they vary from place to place, what more could be done on a community level to support tenants facing eviction due to hardship?
That's a fantastic question. It makes you think about the role of advocacy groups, legal aid organizations, and government programs. What if there were just more accessible resources, clearer information, and stronger safety nets?
And even just raising awareness within communities. If people understood their rights and where to turn for help, it could prevent a lot of unnecessary stress and hardship.
Absolutely. It's a multifaceted issue, and finding solutions requires a collaborative effort from individuals, communities, and policymakers.
Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into eviction hardship extensions. We hope this information has been helpful and empowering.
Remember, facing eviction is challenging, but with the right knowledge and support, you can navigate it successfully. Stay informed, stay proactive, and don't hesitate to reach out for help. There are people who want to see you succeed.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.